The 4th of June 1942 dawned gray and cold over the Pacific Ocean, and with it came a day that would reshape the destiny of nations. In the pre-dawn darkness, American cryptanalysts at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor had already been awake for hours. Their eyes bloodshot from weeks of relentless work deciphering the Japanese naval code designated JN-25. What they had discovered would prove more valuable than a fleet of battleships. Commander Joseph Rochefort stood in the basement of the old administration building at Pearl Harbor, his red smoking jacket draped over his uniform, a quirk his subordinates had grown accustomed to during his marathon code-breaking sessions. The concrete walls seemed to press in on him as he studied the intercepts one more time. The Japanese were coming to Midway. He was certain of it. But convincing Admiral Chester Nimitz in Washington of his intelligence required more than intuition. The intercepts had been frustratingly vague. Japanese planners referred to their target as a F in their coded messages. Rochefort believed AF meant Midway Atoll. Skeptics in Washington insisted it could be the Aleutian Islands or even the west coast of the United States. The stakes were catastrophic if he was wrong. The Pacific Fleet, still recovering from the devastation of Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, would be steaming into a trap. Then came the brilliant deception. Rochefort arranged for Midway to send an uncoded message reporting that their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. Within days, Japanese intercepts reported that AF was short of fresh water. But the proof was irrefutable. According to documentation from the Naval History and Heritage Command, this single act of cryptographic verification gave Admiral Nimitz the confidence to position his carriers northeast of Midway, lying in wait for the unsuspecting Japanese fleet. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was orchestrating the most ambitious naval operation Japan had ever attempted. His plan involved multiple task forces spread across thousands of miles of ocean. The main striking force under Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo would attack Midway with 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, and their pilots were among the most experienced in the world. Yamamoto's strategy relied on surprise and overwhelming force. He believed the Americans would not discover his approach until Midway was already under attack. Then, when the American carriers rushed to defend the atoll, his superior force would destroy them in a decisive battle. With the Pacific Fleet eliminated, Japan could dictate terms for peace, securing their conquered empire in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But Yamamoto made a fatal assumption. He believed his codes were unbreakable. Admiral Nimitz, a Texan with a calm demeanor that masked an aggressive tactical mind, studied his options. He had 3 carriers available: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Yorktown had been severely damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea just a month earlier and was expected to need months of repairs. Navy yard workers at Pearl Harbor accomplished what seemed impossible, completing emergency repairs in just 72 hours. The carrier would fight, even if she wasn't fully healed. Nimitz knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. Japanese intelligence estimated that Yorktown had been sunk at Coral Sea, giving the Americans only 2 operational carriers. This miscalculation would prove costly. Nimitz positioned his carriers under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher and Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese scout planes. They would wait hidden, while Nagumo's force approached the atoll, unsuspecting. The trap was set. In the cold Pacific waters, American sailors prepared for battle, many of them knowing they might not see another sunrise. The 3rd of June 1942 found Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo aboard his flagship Akagi, steaming steadily eastward through fog and intermittent rain. The veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean raids sat in his cabin reviewing the operational plans one final time. Around him, the most powerful carrier striking force ever assembled by Japan moved through the darkness like steel phantoms. Nagumo was 55 years old, torpedo warfare specialist who had risen through the ranks during an era when Japan's Navy had transformed itself from a regional power to a force that dominated the Pacific. His reputation was built on caution and thoroughness. His qualities that had served him well during peacetime, but now created tension with more aggressive officers under his command. Commander Minoru Ginda, his air operations officer, had expressed concerns about the complexity of the Midway operation, but Yamamoto's orders were clear. The Japanese task force was formidable beyond imagination. 4 carriers with 248 aircraft, supported by 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers. The pilots were veterans of campaigns in China, Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and throughout the Southwest Pacific. Many had over 1,000 hours of flight time. Their Mitsubishi Zero fighters had established air superiority wherever they appeared, capable of outmaneuvering any American fighter in service. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized offensive action and the decisive battle. Since Admiral Haihachiro Togo's victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, every Japanese naval officer had been trained to seek the one climactic engagement that would destroy the enemy in a single stroke. Midway was intended to be that battle, drawing out the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet for annihilation. But the operational plan contained dangerous assumptions. Yamamoto had divided his forces, sending a diversionary attack against the Aleutian Islands to draw American attention north. The battleship force, including the massive Yamato with Yamamoto himself aboard, followed hundreds of miles behind the carrier force. The scattered disposition meant that if something went wrong, the various elements could not support each other. Nagumo would face whatever came alone. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, selected to lead the first attack wave on Midway, gathered his pilots in Haryu's ready room. The atmosphere was confident, almost celebratory. These men had struck at will across the Pacific for 6 months, without significant opposition. They had sunk the British carrier Hermes, battleships Prince of Wales, and Repulse, and ravaged Darwin, Australia. Midway was expected to be another in a string of overwhelming victories. Tominaga was a professional, methodical in his planning. He briefed his pilots on the expected defenses: submarine fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, and the garrison on the atoll itself. Intelligence suggested the Americans might have reinforced Midway, but nothing the strike force couldn't handle. The real prize would come later when the American carriers appeared. Then the Japanese superiority in aircraft and pilot skill would tell the decisive tale. What the Japanese didn't know was that their every move had been anticipated. While Nagumo's force steamed eastward in apparent secrecy, American cryptanalysts had been reading his mail for weeks. The element of surprise, that precious commodity Yamamoto counted on, had already been lost. On the evening of June 3rd, a PBY Catalina patrol plane spotted Japanese transport ships 700 miles west of Midway. These were part of the invasion force, not the carriers, but it confirmed what Rochefort had predicted. 9 B-17 Flying Fortresses took off from Midway for a high-altitude bombing attack. They scored no hits, but the action alerted the Japanese that Midway was on guard. Nagumo received the report with some concern but no alarm. Bombing from high altitude rarely achieved results, and patrol planes were to be expected. What mattered was that no American carriers had been spotted. His intelligence assured him that Enterprise and Hornet were still near the Solomon Islands, thousands of miles away. Yorktown was at the bottom of the Coral Sea. He had nothing to fear from American carriers. This confidence, this certainty of Japanese superiority and American weakness, permeated the entire strike force. In the carrier ready rooms, pilots played cards and wrote letters home. Mechanics performed final checks on aircraft engines. Ordnance crews prepared bombs for the attack on Midway, scheduled for dawn. Gaust, the 4th of June, would test whether confidence built on past victories could overcome present miscalculation. As midnight passed, the opposing forces moved inexorably toward their rendezvous with history. The 2nd of June, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood at the submarine base at Pearl Harbor, watching his carriers depart. The sight stirred both pride and anxiety within him. Enterprise and Hornet had sortied on the 28th of May, followed by the hastily repaired Yorktown on the 30th. They were steaming to a position northeast of Midway that Nimitz had designated Point Luck. The name was appropriate, for Luck would play its part in the coming battle. Nimitz had given tactical command to Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher aboard Yorktown. Fletcher was 56, experienced, and had commanded carrier forces at Coral Sea. Some officers questioned his aggressive instincts, but Nimitz trusted his judgment. Accompanying Fletcher was Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise, commanding the task force that included Hornet. Spruance's appointment was itself a stroke of fortune. Vice Admiral William Halsey, who normally commanded Enterprise's task force, was hospitalized with severe dermatitis. Halsey had recommended his cruiser commander Spruance as his replacement. Spruance had never commanded carriers in combat, But he possessed something more valuable: a brilliant tactical mind and the temperament to remain calm under pressure. At 55 years old, he was known throughout the fleet as a thinker, an officer who studied problems from every angle before acting. Where Halsey might charge in with aggressive enthusiasm, Spruance would calculate, position, and strike with surgical precision. The American carriers represented the entire Pacific Fleet's striking power. Enterprise and Hornet each carried approximately 80 aircraft. Yorktown, operating with partial air groups due to Coral Sea losses, carried around 75. In total, the Americans could muster approximately 233 carrier aircraft against the Japanese force. The numbers were nearly even, but experience favored the Japanese dramatically. Many American pilots were fresh from training with minimal combat experience. The torpedo bomber squadrons flew Douglas TBD Devastators, aircraft that were obsolete and painfully slow. The fighters, Grumman F-4F Wildcats, were tough and could absorb punishment, but they couldn't match the Zero's maneuverability. Only the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers gave the Americans a technological advantage, their accuracy in the dive making them deadly ship killers. At Midway itself, the Marines and Navy personnel prepared for the expected assault. Midway Atoll consisted of two small islands, Sand and Eastern, surrounding a lagoon. The garrison included the 6th Marine Defense Battalion with coastal artillery and anti-aircraft guns, Marine Fighter Squadron 221 with 21 Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters and 7 Wildcats, and Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241 with obsolete aircraft. Additionally, Navy PBY, Catalina patrol planes, and Army Air Force B-17 bombers operated from the atoll. Commander Cyril Simard, the atoll's commander, knew his forces were inadequate to stop a determined Japanese attack. His job was to survive and inflict damage while the carriers did the real fighting. Every gun position was reinforced, every aircraft armed and ready. The Marines, many of them young men who had never seen combat, checked their weapons and waited. The Catalina patrol planes were the eyes of Midway, flying long-range reconnaissance missions in a vast arc west and north of the atoll. Lieutenant Howard Ady and Ensign Jack Reed piloted PBY-5 Alpha on the 4th of June, searching through patches of fog and rain. At 0530 hours, breaking through the clouds, they spotted the unmistakable sight that every man at Midway had been anticipating. Main body read transmitted. The coordinates placed the Japanese carriers 200 miles northwest of Midway on a direct approach vector. Within minutes, every American force in the Central Pacific knew the enemy had arrived. On Midway, air raid sirens wailed. Marine pilots sprinted to their fighters. Bombers were launched to get them away from the ground and into the attack. Aboard Yorktown, Fletcher received the contact report at 0-6-0-3. He turned to his staff with a slight smile. Nimitz and Rochefort had been exactly right. The Japanese were where intelligence predicted, approaching from where they expected to achieve surprise. Instead, they were steaming into a carefully prepared ambush. Fletcher ordered Spruance to proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers when definitely located. The American carriers began launching scout planes to pinpoint the exact location of Nagumo's force. Below decks, pilots received their final briefings. Many were quiet, contemplating what lay ahead. They understood the odds. Torpedo squadrons especially faced suicide missions, required to fly low and slow through walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Zeros, yet not one man refused to fly. They represented America's response to Pearl Harbor, and they would not be found wanting. Point Luck was living up to its name. The Americans had achieved surprise against an enemy that believed itself invulnerable. Now came the test of whether courage and determination could overcome Japan's technical superiority and combat experience. As the sun climbed higher in the Pacific sky, two fleets moved toward collision. The 4th of June 1942 at 0430 hours, reveille sounded aboard the Japanese carriers. Within the crowded crew spaces, sailors rolled from their hammocks and prepared for what they expected to be another day of victory. On the flight decks, mechanics completed pre-flight checks, while ordnance crews wheeled bombs and torpedoes into position. The launch of the Midway strike force was scheduled for 0430, with aircraft beginning to spot on deck in the pre-dawn darkness. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led 108 aircraft toward Midway, 36 Kate bombers carrying bombs, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. The formation assembled efficiently, a testament to the Japanese carrier crew's skill, and turned southeast toward their target. Behind them, Nagumo kept 93 aircraft in reserve, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for use against any American ships that might appear. At Midway, the Marine fighters scrambled to intercept. Captain John Carey led 14 Buffaloes and 7 Wildcats climbing desperately for altitude. The Buffalo was a rotund, underpowered fighter that had been rejected by the Navy as inadequate. The Marines flying them knew they were outmatched. Captain Marion Carl, one of the Wildcat pilots, later said the only advantage they had was courage. At 06:16 hours, the two formations met 30 miles northwest of Midway. The results were devastatingly one-sided. The Zeros tore through the Marine formation with ruthless efficiency. The Buffaloes, slow and ungainly, fell from the sky like wounded birds. Within minutes, 15 of the 21 Marine fighters were shot down or badly damaged. Captain Carey, wounded and flying a damaged aircraft, managed to land his Buffalo on Midway's cratered runway. The pilots lost, many were killed in the air. Others died in fiery crashes on the ocean below. The sacrifice of the Marine fighters allowed some bombers from Midway to reach the Japanese fleet. 6 Navy TBF Avengers, 4 Army B-1E6 Marauders, 16 Marine Dauntless dive bombers, and 11 Marine Vindicators attacked Nagumo's carriers between 0-7-0-5 and 0-8-20 hours. They pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot down. 2 of the B-1E6s crashed in flames. The dive bombers and torpedo planes ran a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire and Zero fighters that seemed to fill the sky. Not a single bomb or torpedo struck a Japanese ship. The attacks were uncoordinated, allowing the carriers to maneuver and the fighters to concentrate on each wave separately. Japanese sailors watched with grim satisfaction as American aircraft tumbled into the sea trailing smoke. To the Japanese, it confirmed their superiority. Their carriers remained untouched, their formation intact, their confidence unshaken. But these desperate, failed attacks had an unintended consequence that would prove decisive. They kept the Japanese carriers maneuvering violently, breaking formation and delaying their own operations. More critically, they forced Nagumo into a fateful decision about his reserve aircraft. Tomonaga's strike force hit Midway at 06:30 hours. The Japanese pilots were professionals, methodical in their destruction. They bombed the power plant, destroyed fuel tanks, cratered the runways, and set numerous buildings ablaze. Marine anti-aircraft fire was intense, damaging several aircraft and forcing Tomonaga's own plane to take hits that damaged its fuel tank. But the base continued to function. At 0700 hours, Tomonaga radioed back to Nagumo, "There is need for a second attack." This message created a dilemma. Nagumo's reserve aircraft were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships. Switching their armament to bombs for a second Midway strike would take time and leave him temporarily vulnerable. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, and Air Officer Genda, both urged caution. American carriers might be in the area. But no American carriers had been spotted, and Midway needed to be neutralized. At 0-7-15, Nagumo made his decision. He ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed for a second strike on Midway. On the carrier hangar decks, ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and replacing them with bombs. Torpedoes were carefully stowed, bombs wheeled out and attached to aircraft. The hangar decks became crowded with explosive ordnance, fuel lines, and aircraft. Then, at 0-7-20-8, everything changed. A reconnaissance plane from the cruiser Tone, launched late due to catapult problems, transmitted a message that electrified the Japanese fleet. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 degrees. Distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo's blood ran cold. American ships in strength exactly where they shouldn't be. Immediately ordered the rearming halted, but chaos had already taken root. Some aircraft had bombs, others still had torpedoes. The hangar decks were cluttered with ordnance. Tomonaga's Midway strike force was returning, low on fuel and needing to land immediately. The carriers would need to turn into the wind for recovery, taking them away from the American position. At 0-7-40-5, the Tone scout plane sent another message. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nagumo felt relief wash over him. No carriers mentioned. Perhaps this was just a cruiser force. Then, at 0-8-0-9, enemy ships accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. A carrier. The Americans had a carrier, and it was within striking range. The 4th of June, 1942. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron sat in the cockpit of his Douglas TBD Devastator, engine idling, waiting for the launch order. Waldron was 41 years old, part Sioux Indian, and commander of Torpedo Squadron 8 aboard the carrier Hornet. His 15 Devastators represented America's first striking power heading toward the Japanese fleet. And he knew with grim certainty that many of his men would not return. The TBD Devastator was obsolete before the war started. It cruised at 115 miles per hour and could barely exceed 200 miles per hour in level flight. During the torpedo run, approaching a target at low altitude, it slowed to less than 100 miles per hour. It carried only one defensive machine gun, operated by the radio man in the rear seat. Against Zeros and concentrated anti-aircraft fire, the Devastator was a flying coffin. At 0-9-0-6 hours, Enterprise and Hornet began launching their strike groups. The plan called for coordinated attacks by torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. Coordination would force the Japanese to divide their defenses. Dive bombers attacking from high altitude simultaneously with torpedo planes at wave height would overwhelm the carriers' ability to maneuver and respond. But coordination required precise timing and communication, difficult in an era before radar homing beacons and reliable radio navigation. Waldron had studied Japanese tactics intensively. He believed the enemy carriers would turn northeast after launching their Midway strike, positioning to attack any American carriers discovered. He argued with his air group commander about the search vector, but was overruled. Waldron made his own navigation plan, telling his pilots to follow him regardless of where the rest of the strike group went. Torpedo 8 departed Hornet at 0-9-0-6, followed by the dive bombers and fighters. Almost immediately, the formation began to separate. Visibility was poor, with clouds and rain squalls scattered across the search area. Radio discipline meant minimal communication. The fighters flying at higher altitude lost sight of the slow torpedo planes below. The dive bombers diverged on a different heading. Within 30 minutes, the carefully planned coordinated strike had fragmented into separate, unsupported elements. Waldron held his course, trusting his intuition and calculations. At approximately 1000 hours, he spotted smoke on the horizon, the Japanese fleet exactly where he predicted. He waggled his wings and led his squadron toward the enemy. Behind him, 15 Devastators followed in their commanding officer's wake. They were alone, without fighter cover, without dive bombers, just 15 obsolete torpedo planes approaching the most powerful carrier force in the Pacific. Ensign George Gay, flying in Waldron's formation, watched the Japanese fleet grow larger. For carriers in a rough box formation, surrounded by a screen of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, the sky above them swarmed with Zeros. Gay counted 50 or more fighters circling in combat air patrol. The anti-aircraft fire, when it began, looked like a black curtain rising from the ocean. Waldron pressed the attack. There was no alternative, no possibility of retreat. His orders were to attack the enemy carriers, and attack he would. At 10:10 hours, Torpedo 8 entered the final run. The Zeros fell on them like hawks on sparrows. Machine gun bullets ripped through fabric-covered fuselages. Fuel tanks exploded. Aircraft fell away, trailing flames and smoke. Waldron's plane was hit almost immediately, fire erupting from the engine. He managed to keep flying for precious seconds before the Devastator plunged into the Pacific. Plane after plane followed him down. Ensign Gay watched his wingman take fire, the aircraft disintegrating in midair. The radio man was blown out of the plane, his parachute opening just before he hit the water. Then Gay's own plane was hit. The hydraulics failed. His gunner, Bob Huntington, stopped firing. Gay glanced back and saw Huntington slumped over his gun, killed by a Zero's cannon shells. Gay continued alone, toward the carrier Akagi, now less than 1,000 yards away. Every gun on the Japanese fleet seemed aimed at him. His wings were shredded with bullet holes. The engine was smoking. He dropped his torpedo, uncertain if it armed or ran true, and pulled up sharply to clear Akagi's flight deck. The Zero's machine gun fire stitched across his plane. The Devastator nosed over and crashed into the ocean. Gay struggled free of the sinking aircraft and surfaced gasping. Around him, debris from Torpedo 8 littered the water. He was the only survivor. 15 aircraft, 30 men, wiped out in less than 10 minutes. Not a single torpedo had struck a Japanese ship. While Torpedo 8 died, other American torpedo squadrons were approaching. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, attacked from a different angle at 10:20 hours. The results were identical. 10 of 14 Devastators were shot down, no hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, pressed their attack at 10:25. 12 of 13 aircraft were destroyed, again no hits. Of 41 American torpedo planes that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only 6 survived. The torpedo squadrons had been slaughtered, their sacrifice seemingly pointless. Japanese sailors watched the carnage with grim satisfaction. Their carriers remained untouched. Their combat air patrol had performed brilliantly. The battle appeared to be going exactly as predicted. But the torpedo squadrons had accomplished something crucial, something that would determine the battle's outcome. They had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave height, chasing and killing the low, slow Devastators. The Zero fighters had expended ammunition and burned fuel during the extended combat. They were out of position, at low altitude, when salvation arrived from above. American dive bombers, approaching unseen at 14,000 feet, were about to write a different ending to the story. The 4th of June, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled at 14,000 feet, searching desperately for the Japanese fleet. McCluskey commanded Enterprise's air group, leading 33 dauntless dive bombers that had been airborne for over 2 hours. Their fuel was running low. If they didn't find the enemy soon, they would have to choose between ditching in the ocean or attempting the long flight back to Enterprise with nearly empty tanks. McCluskey had flown the search vector assigned by Enterprise's air operations, expecting to find the Japanese carriers at the calculated intercept point. They weren't there. He had extended the search southwest, still nothing. His pilots were questioning whether to turn back. Some dive bombers, critically low on fuel, had already departed for Enterprise. McCluskey made a decision that bordered on insubordination. He would continue searching, trusting that the enemy was out here somewhere. At 10:05 hours, McCluskey spotted something in the vast blue emptiness below, a single Japanese destroyer steaming northeast at high speed. The destroyer was Arashi, which had been delayed depth charging the American submarine Nautilus and was now racing to rejoin the carrier formation. McCluskey gambled everything on following Arashi's wake. At 10:20 hours, his gamble paid off. The Japanese carriers appeared below, diamond-shaped in formation, their decks crowded with aircraft.
Oh, good.
McCluskey felt his heart race. This was the moment every Navy pilot trained for, the opportunity to strike at the heart of enemy power. He quickly assessed the situation. 4 carriers visible: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Akagi and Kaga were closest, separated by perhaps a half-mile. McCluskey made instantaneous tactical decisions. He would take his Enterprise bombers against Kaga. He ordered Lieutenant Dick Best's squadron to hit Akagi. What McCluskey didn't know was that Yorktown's dive bombers, 17 aircraft under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, were approaching from a different direction at almost the same moment. Leslie had found the Japanese fleet independently and was preparing to attack. The coordination that had failed with the torpedo squadrons was about to succeed spectacularly through pure chance. 3 squadrons of dive bombers were converging on the Japanese carriers simultaneously, and the Japanese combat air patrol was still at wave height, out of position and unable to intervene. Below on the Japanese carriers, organized chaos reigned. The Midway strike force had just landed and was being struck below to the hangar decks for refueling and rearming. The reserve strike force, which had been rearmed for the Midway attack and then ordered back to anti-ship weapons, was spotted on the flight decks ready for launch. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks. Ordnance carts with bombs and torpedoes stood nearby. Ships were at their most vulnerable, floating ammunition dumps waiting for a spark. Lieutenant Dick Best pushed over into his dive at 10:22 hours, followed by his squadron. The dive bomber pilots called it the ultimate thrill, a 70-degree dive from 14,000 feet. The aircraft accelerating to over 250 miles per hour, the target growing larger in the bomb sight. Best's practice runs, hundreds of them during training, came together in these 30 seconds. He centered Akagi in his sight, adjusted for wind and the carrier's movement, and released his 1,000-pound bomb at 2,000 feet. According to historical records maintained by the Naval War College, Best's bomb struck Akagi almost dead center near the midship elevator. The explosion penetrated to the hangar deck where fuel lines were open and armed aircraft were packed together. Secondary explosions followed immediately. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedoes cooked off. Within seconds, Akagi was transformed from the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy to a burning wreck. McCluskey's bombers hit Kaga almost simultaneously. 3 or 4 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession. One penetrated the flight deck near the bridge, killing everyone in the command structure. Another hit near the forward elevator, detonating aircraft below. A third struck amidships, starting uncontrollable fires. Kaga's deck became an inferno as fuel and munitions exploded in chain reactions. Yorktown's dive bombers found Soryu. Leslie's own bomb malfunctioned and fell away during his approach, but his squadron scored 3 direct hits on the carrier. The first bomb struck near the forward elevator. The second hit the center of the flight deck. The third crashed through to the hangar deck. All 3 detonated among fully fueled and armed aircraft. Soryu was engulfed in flames within minutes. The attack lasted approximately 5 minutes. 5 minutes in which 3 Japanese fleet carriers were mortally wounded. 5 minutes that reversed 6 months of Japanese triumph. 5 minutes that changed the course of the Pacific War and, arguably, the entire Second World War. Ensign George Gay, still floating in the water from his earlier ordeal with Torpedo 8, watched the dive bombers attack from his front row seat among the waves. He saw the bombs falling, heard the explosions, watched the massive columns of smoke rising from the carriers. Despite his exhaustion and injuries, he felt hope surge through him. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had not been in vain. On the Japanese carriers, hell had descended. Damage control parties struggled against fires that consumed entire ships. Aboard Akagi, the firefighting systems failed. Burning fuel spread across the hangar deck. Explosions walked through the ship as ordnance cooked off. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge, stunned, watching his flagship die around him. Staff officers urged him to transfer his flag to another ship. The once proud Akagi was finished. Kaga and Soryu fared no better. Both carriers were abandoned within hours, their crews forced to evacuate as internal explosions tore them apart. Of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months ago, 3 were now burning dead in the water. Their futures measured in hours at most. The 4th of June, 1942, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of his flagship Hiryu. Watching smoke columns rise from Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, Yamaguchi was 57 years old, considered one of the most aggressive and capable officers in the Japanese Navy. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in the same class as Yamamoto. Now his carrier was the only one still operational in Nagumo's strike force, and the responsibility for salvaging this disaster fell on his shoulders. Yamaguchi ordered an immediate strike prepared. Hiryu's aircraft had been held in reserve during the morning's confusion. Now they would carry Japan's counterattack. At 10:40 hours, 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched from Hiryu's deck. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike. His orders simple: find the American carriers and destroy them. A Japanese scout plane had reported a carrier to the northeast. That would be Kobayashi's target. The American carriers had also been dealing with confusion. Fletcher's flagship Yorktown had taken bomb damage to its radar early in the morning and was operating with limited awareness. At 11:59 hours, Yorktown's radar picked up incoming aircraft at 46 miles. The Combat Air Patrol was vectored to intercept. Fighter direction had improved since the war's beginning, but the Wildcats still struggled against the more maneuverable Zeros. At approximately 12:10 hours, Kobayashi's dive bombers broke through the fighter screen and anti-aircraft fire. Yorktown's captain, Elliot Buckmaster, threw his ship into violent maneuvers. The carrier heeled over sharply, turning at maximum speed. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky with black puffs. Tracers arced toward the diving bombers. But the Japanese pilots were the elite of their service, and several bombs struck home. The first bomb penetrated Yorktown's flight deck and exploded in the funnel uptakes, killing crew members and disrupting the ship's boilers. A second bomb exploded deep in the ship, starting fires and rupturing fuel lines. A third hit near the island structure, causing extensive damage to the command spaces. Within minutes, Yorktown slowed to a stop, power lost, smoke pouring from multiple wounds. Buckmaster and his crew performed heroically. Damage control parties fought the fires. Engineers struggled to restore power. By 1400 hours, incredibly, Yorktown was making 17 knots and preparing to recover aircraft. The crew had accomplished what seemed impossible, bringing their wounded carrier back from the brink. Fletcher transferred tactical command to Spruance on Enterprise and continued coordinating the battle from Yorktown despite the damage. But Hiryu wasn't finished. Yamaguchi launched a second strike at 1330 hours. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters, led by Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, the same officer who had led the morning strike on Midway. Tominaga knew his aircraft had been damaged over Midway and was losing fuel. This would be a one-way mission. Accepted this without hesitation, duty and honor more important than survival. The torpedo planes found Yorktown at 1430 hours. Buckmaster again maneuvered desperately, but torpedo attacks from multiple directions are nearly impossible to evade. At 1443 hours, 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side. The explosions opened massive holes below the waterline. The carrier took on a 17-degree list. Power failed completely. Flooding was uncontrollable. At 1500 hours, Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship. The crew went over the side in good order, disciplined even in disaster. Destroyers moved alongside to pick up survivors. Yorktown remained afloat, listing heavily but refusing to sink. Fletcher transferred to the cruiser Astoria and resumed command of the overall task force. But Yorktown was finished as a fighting unit. 2 strikes from Hiryu had accomplished what appeared impossible, crippling an American fleet carrier. Yet Hiryu's success carried the seeds of its own destruction. The American carriers Enterprise and Hornet now knew exactly where Hiryu was located. The strike planes that had attacked earlier had returned and been recovered. Fresh aircraft were being armed and fueled. At 1530 hours, Enterprise launched 24 dive bombers. Hornet followed with 16 more. Their target was the last operational Japanese carrier. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led Enterprise's bombers toward Hiryu. At 1700 hours, they found the carrier steaming northwest, accompanied by 2 battleships and 3 cruisers. The protective screen looked formidable, but after the morning's success, the American dive bomber pilots approached with confidence. The combat air patrol rose to meet them, but there were fewer Zeros now, depleted by constant combat and losses. Gallagher's dive bombers attacked at 1705 hours. The first bomb hit Hiryu forward of the bridge, penetrating to the hangar deck and starting massive fires. 3 more bombs followed in quick succession, all hits or near misses. Hiryu's flight deck erupted in flames. The pattern from the morning repeated itself. Fire spread to the hangar deck, ordnance exploded, fuel ignited, and damage control efforts proved futile. Yamaguchi refused to leave his ship. When staff officers urged him to transfer his flag, he declined. Hiryu was his command, and he would remain with her. Captain Tomio Kaku, Hiryu's commanding officer, made the same decision. Both men stayed aboard as fires consumed the carrier from within. Crew was ordered to abandon ship at 0230 hours on June 5th. Yamaguchi and Kaku remained on the bridge, went down with their ship, when Hiryu finally sank later that morning. By 1700 hours on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed or doomed. The Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that had rampaged across the Pacific, was finished. In a single day, Japan had lost the heart of its naval air power. The ships could be replaced, given time. The experienced pilots and crew, trained over years of intensive preparation, could not. The 4th of June 1942 transitioned into the 5th, with both fleets licking their wounds and attempting to understand what had happened. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard the super battleship Yamato, 300 miles behind the burning carriers, received damage reports with mounting disbelief. All 4 fleet carriers gone. The cream of Japan's naval air power wiped out, the invasion of Midway impossible. The decisive battle he had planned had indeed occurred, but with catastrophic results for Japan. Yamamoto considered his options through the night. He still had massive firepower available, the battleships Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, and Mutsu, along with cruisers and destroyers. If he could force a night surface action, his superior gunnery might destroy the American carriers. But Spruance, now in tactical command of the American forces, had anticipated this possibility and withdrew eastward during the night. He would not risk his carriers in a surface engagement where Japanese optical superiority and superior night fighting capability would tell. The submarines USS Nautilus and USS Grayling reported the burning Japanese carriers throughout the night. Nautilus's skipper, Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, had been driven off by depth charges earlier, but returned to observe the destruction. At 0600 hours on June 5th, he found the burning hulk of Kaga still afloat and fired 3 torpedoes. 2 were duds, typical of the faulty American torpedoes that plagued the submarine force throughout 1942. 1 hit but failed to sink the carrier. Kaga finally went down at 19-20-5 hours, taking 800 men with her. Soryu sank first of the 4 carriers at 1913 hours on June 4th. Kage lasted through the night, fires consuming her from within, before Japanese destroyers torpedoed her at 0500 hours on June 5th to prevent capture. The flagship that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor disappeared beneath the Pacific waves. Here you fought her fires longest, but by 0230 hours on June 5th, the situation was hopeless. Captain Kaku and Admiral Yamaguchi remained aboard as the crew abandoned ship. Here you sank at 0912 hours on June 5th. Yorktown refused to die. Despite 2 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits, the carrier remained afloat through the night of June 4th. At dawn on June 5th, Captain Buckmaster returned aboard with a salvage party, hoping to save the ship. They made progress controlling flooding and reducing the list. A destroyer took Yorktown under tow, slowly moving toward Pearl Harbor. For a day it appeared the carrier might survive. Then, on June 6th at 30:36 hours, Japanese submarine I-1-6-8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, penetrated the destroyer screen and fired for torpedoes. 1 hit the destroyer USS Hammond, breaking her in half and sinking her in for minutes with 80 casualties. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown. The massive explosions undid all the salvage work. Yorktown took on a severe list again. At 0500 hours on June 7th, the carrier rolled over and sank. She had survived 4 days, refusing to give up, but even that gallant ship had limits. Yamamoto withdrew westward on June 5th, recognizing that continuing the operation was futile. The American carriers had not been destroyed. Midway remained in American hands. The planned invasion was impossible without air superiority. He sent a message to all units. The Midway operation is canceled. The return to Japan would be a voyage of shame for the surviving ships and crews. Spruance pursued cautiously on June 5th and 6th. His orders from Nimitz were clear: will be governed by the principle of calculated risk. Spruance interpreted this to mean engaging when the balance was favorable, but avoiding needless risk. He launched airstrikes against retreating Japanese ships, sinking the heavy cruiser Makuma and damaging the cruiser Magami on June 6th. But he did not pursue deep into waters where Japanese land-based air could reach him. The battle statistics told a story of one-sided victory. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 carrier aircraft, and approximately 3,000 men. America lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. The losses were not proportionate. Japan had gambled its carrier strength on a decisive victory and lost catastrophically. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz received the reports with satisfaction, but not jubilation. He understood that one battle, however decisive, did not win a war. Japan still held vast conquered territories. Their land-based air forces remained powerful. Their battleship fleet was largely intact. The war would continue for years, but Midway had changed the strategic balance. Japan would never again possess the overwhelming carrier superiority it had held for 6 months. The initiative in the Pacific had shifted to America. The cryptanalysts at Station HYPO led by Commander Rochefort, had made victory possible. Their breaking of Japanese codes gave Nimitz the advantage of knowledge, allowing him to position his forces for ambush. After the battle, Rochefort received the Distinguished Service Medal, though politics would later see him transferred from his code-breaking duties, a typical military bureaucracy failing to appreciate genius. The pilots and aircrews, especially the torpedo squadron men who died in their attacks, had paid the blood price for victory. Of the torpedo squadron pilots who attacked, fewer than 20% survived. Their sacrifice pulled the Japanese combat air patrol out of position, enabling the dive bombers to strike unopposed. Military historians debate whether the torpedo attacks were necessary or simply tragic waste. The men who flew them didn't have that luxury. They followed orders, attacked the enemy, and died doing their duty. The 4th through 7th of June, 1942, marked the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War and arguably one of the most important battles in world history. Military historians have spent 8 decades analyzing what went right for America, what went wrong for Japan, and why the battle unfolded as it did. The answers illuminate how warfare, intelligence, leadership, and chance intersect to determine outcomes. Japan's defeat began before the battle started, with the fundamental flaw in their strategic planning. Admiral Yamamoto designed an operation of excessive complexity, dividing his forces across thousands of miles. The Aleutian Diversion sent to light carriers and supporting ships north, forces that could have accompanied Nagumo. The battleship group with Yamato followed far behind the carriers, unable to provide support when needed. Japanese doctrine emphasized concentration of force, yet the Midway operation violated this principle. The assumption of surprise was Yamamoto's critical error. Japanese intelligence had failed to detect American code-breaking efforts. They believed their communications were secure when, in reality, American cryptanalysts were reading their operational plans in near real time. This intelligence failure stemmed from overconfidence, a belief that Western powers couldn't match Japanese capabilities. The irony was that Japan had successfully broken American codes before Pearl Harbor, but assumed the reverse was impossible. Nagumo's decision-making during the battle reflected the confusion inherent in the Japanese plan. When Tomonaga requested a second strike on Midway, Nagumo faced incomplete information. No American carriers had been reported. Midway needed neutralizing before the invasion. The decision to rearm his reserve aircraft appeared sound based on available intelligence. Then the Tone Scout plane, launched late, reported American ships, including a carrier. Nagumo was caught with aircraft in the wrong configuration, ordnance cluttering his hangar decks, and Tomonaga's Midway strike returning low on fuel. The rearming confusion has generated debate among historians. Some argue Nagumo should have launched whatever he had immediately. Others note that launching an uncoordinated, partially armed strike would have wasted aircraft for minimal effect. The real issue was that Nagumo faced an impossible situation created by the flawed operational plan. No decision available to him at that point would have changed the fundamental reality. American carriers were in position to strike, while his carriers were vulnerable. Japanese combat air patrol doctrine also contributed to defeat. The Zeros were positioned to defend against torpedo attacks at wave height, appropriate given the morning's action. But they lacked radar or effective fighter direction to respond to threats from multiple altitudes simultaneously. When the dive bombers arrived at 14,000 feet, while Zeros were engaging torpedo planes at sea level, the Japanese had no capability to vector fighters to the new threat. By radar-based fighter direction from the carriers, could be positioned more effectively. The sacrifice of American torpedo squadrons, while tactically unsuccessful, proved strategically vital. Their attacks kept Japanese carriers maneuvering, disrupting landing and launch operations. They forced the combat air patrol down to wave height. They consumed Japanese ammunition and fuel. Most importantly, they occupied Japanese attention at the critical moment when dive bombers approached from above. The torpedo pilots didn't know they were creating this opportunity. They attacked because those were their orders. But their courage under hopeless circumstances enabled the victory. The dive bomber attacks succeeded through a combination of skill, timing, and chance. McCluskey's decision to continue searching when his assigned intercept point proved empty. His spotting of Arashi, his following the destroyers' wake to the carriers. Each step involved judgment and risk. The near-simultaneous arrival of 3 dive bomber squadrons from different directions was not coordinated. It was fortune. But fortune, as Napoleon observed, favors the prepared. American pilots had trained extensively in dive bombing. The Dauntless was an excellent aircraft for its role. The 1,000-pound bombs were powerful enough to devastate carriers. When opportunity came, American pilots were ready to exploit it. Leadership differences between the American and Japanese commanders affected the battle's outcome. Nimitz trusted his intelligence and positioned his forces accordingly. He gave tactical command to Fletcher and Spruance, then allowed them to fight the battle. Fletcher and Spruance exercised aggressive but not reckless tactics. They struck when opportunity presented itself. They withdrew when prudent. They understood Nimitz's guidance about calculated risk and operated accordingly. Conversely, Japanese command structure was conflicted. Yamamoto directed the overall operation but remained hundreds of miles away aboard Yamato. Unable to influence tactical decisions in real time, Nagumo exercised tactical command but was bound by Yamamoto's operational plan. The divided command created delays and confusion when rapid decisions were needed. When disaster struck, Yamamoto couldn't intervene effectively, and Nagumo couldn't adapt the overall strategy. The technical factors deserve examination. American damage control proved superior to Japanese practices. Yorktown, severely damaged twice, remained afloat for days and might have been saved but for the submarine attack. Japanese carriers, once hit, were consumed by fires that couldn't be contained. This reflected different design philosophies. American carriers incorporated lessons from British experience with better compartmentalization and fire suppression systems. Japanese carriers prioritized offensive capability over survivability, a choice that proved fatal at Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought between the 4th and 7th of June, 1942, cast a shadow across the remainder of World War II and shaped the post-war world in ways its participants could not have imagined. The immediate strategic consequences were clear. Japan's offensive capability was broken. America seized the initiative, and the Pacific War's trajectory fundamentally changed. But the battle's deeper significance emerged over subsequent months and years. Japan could not replace what was lost at Midway. The 4 fleet carriers could eventually be replaced with new construction, and were. But the experienced pilots, aircrew, and deck crew who went down with those carriers represented years of training and combat experience. Japan's pilot training program, already inadequate for a prolonged war, could not produce replacements at the rate America's vast training infrastructure could generate new pilots. Each subsequent battle eroded Japan's qualitative advantage until, by 1944, American pilots were better trained and more numerous than their Japanese counterparts. The strategic initiative passed permanently to America after Midway. Until June 4, 1942, Japan had dictated where and when battles occurred. They struck at Pearl Harbor, Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and across the Pacific on their timetable. After Midway, America chose the time and place of engagements. The invasion of Guadalcanal in August 1942, launched only 2 months after Midway, would have been impossible if Japan still possessed 4 fleet carriers in control of the Central Pacific. Yamamoto recognized the disaster's implications immediately. He wrote privately that Japan needed to seek peace terms while still in a position of relative strength. But the Japanese military and political leadership, committed to the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and unwilling to admit defeat, rejected any thought of negotiated peace. Japan would fight on for 3 more years, suffering increasingly catastrophic defeats culminating in the atomic bombs and Soviet invasion of August 1945. The American public's morale received an enormous boost from Midway. After 6 months of defeat and retreat, finally there was victory. The newspaper headlines proclaimed, "Japs smashed at Midway and Navy wins greatest victory." President Franklin Roosevelt understood the psychological importance of this success. In a radio address on June 9, 1942, he cautiously announced a significant victory without revealing details that might compromise intelligence. The American people, hungry for good news, celebrated accordingly. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan, which would ultimately bring fire to every major Japanese city, became possible after Midway. Control of the Central Pacific allowed America to establish forward bases, moving progressively closer to Japan. The island-hopping campaign, Tarawa, Kwailan, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each brought B-1 bombers within range of Japanese cities. This strategy originated from the post-Midway reality of American dominance at sea. Individual lives were transformed by the battle. Ensign George Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was rescued by a PBY Catalina on June 5th after spending 30 hours in the ocean. He survived the war and spent the rest of his life speaking about his fallen comrades, ensuring their sacrifice was remembered. He died in October 1994, the last living participant from Torpedo 8's final mission. Admiral Spruance became one of America's most successful naval commanders, eventually commanding the Fifth Fleet in the island-hopping campaign. His calculated risk approach at Midway defined his command philosophy throughout the war. Nimitz once said that Spruance's conservatism and prudence balanced perfectly with aggressive tactical sense. Spruance retired in 1948 and died in December 1969, honored as one of the architects of victory in the Pacific. Commander Rochefort, whose code-breaking made Midway possible, faced bureaucratic punishment for his success. Rivals in Washington, jealous of his achievement and uncomfortable with his unconventional methods, engineered his transfer from Station Hap in October 1942. He spent the rest of the war in less critical positions. Not until 1986, 9 years after his death, did the Navy formally recognize his contributions with a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom. His shabby treatment illustrated how institutions sometimes fail their most valuable members. The Japanese participants faced grim fates. Admiral Nagumo, blamed for the disaster despite the flawed operational plan he was executing, was shunted to lesser commands. He died on Saipan in July 1944 during the American invasion, likely by suicide. Admiral Yamamoto was killed in April 1943 when American fighters, again guided by decoded intelligence, intercepted and shot down his aircraft over Bougainville. The architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway died knowing his predictions about Japan's inability to win a prolonged war were proving accurate. The historical debate about Midway continues. Some historians argue the battle was the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when Japan's defeat became inevitable. Others contend that Japan's defeat was inevitable from the moment they attacked America, given the massive disparity in industrial capacity and resources. Midway, in this view, simply made the inevitable visible sooner. Both interpretations contain truth. America's industrial advantage meant Japan probably could not win a prolonged war. But Midway ensured the war would be shortened by removing Japan's offensive capability before it could be used to create an impregnable defensive perimeter. The technological lessons from Midway influenced naval warfare permanently. Carriers were confirmed as the dominant capital ships, replacing battleships in fleet engagements. Radar-based fighter direction proved essential for air defense. Damage control became a critical specialty. Code-breaking's value was demonstrated beyond doubt. These lessons shaped not just the remainder of World War II, but naval doctrine into the 21st century. The broader significance extends beyond military history. Midway illustrated how overconfidence leads to defeat, how intelligence can substitute for material superiority, how courage under hopeless circumstances can enable victory, and how strategic error at the highest levels cannot be remedied by tactical excellence. These lessons apply to conflicts military, political, and economic across all eras. On June 4th each year, ceremonies at Midway Atoll, now a national wildlife refuge, commemorate the battle. The names of the fallen are read. Sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 is honored. Its veterans, when they were still alive, gathered to remember comrades who never grew old. The ceremonies serve as a reminder that freedom's price is paid in blood by young men who answered their nation's call. The Battle of Midway, 70,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean and on the ocean's surface, decided in 5 crucial minutes by 37 dive bomber pilots, changed the world. Japan's march of conquest ended. America's road to victory began. The 1,000 or more men who died there, American and Japanese, gave their lives at the hinge point of history. Their story deserves to be remembered, studied, and honored as long as free nations exist to tell it.